Welcome to Cepher Commentaries. Today we're going to be looking at Bere'shiyth, Genesis, chapter 8. And Elohim remembered Noach and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him. In the ark, and Elohim made a wind to pass over the ark, and the waters assuaged. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated, and the ark rested on the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat, and the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. Okay, so a little bit about this first paragraph. We see fundamentally, and it's a very important point of this, is that we had 150 days that have elapsed from the 17th day of the second month to the 17th day of the 5th of the 7th month, exactly 150 days. Now, you could construe this as, 1 month of 30 days, 2 months of 29 days, and 2 months of 31 days. But it is more often reckoned as 5 30-day months, lending credence to the idea of a 360-day year, or what they call the prophetic year, of 12 30-day months. Now, this is interesting. It's also referenced to some degree in the book of Daniel when you see the idea of 1,260 days being equated to 42 months, and also a time times and half a time, or a time, which would be 1 times 2 and a half a time, 0.5 or 3.5 years. 3.5 years dividing up 1,260 days would equal 42 30-day months. Now, this is also a very interesting feature because it does tend to show a prophetic calendar. However, Daniel 12 may also be instrumental in this, saying that blessed are those who see 1,290 days. That is to say, there's a 30-day term lengthened to it, and then 1,335 days. This may be an ultimate calendaring reckoning that takes place to justify a 360-day prophetic calendar over a period of time, possibly, for instance, that after 3.5 years, we have a reckoning of 30 days. So 1 year is 1,290 days. And even that leaves you short for some period of time, that over a period of 7 years or 14 years, maybe there's an ultimate reckoning that takes you out to the 1335, an additional 45 days. So all of that is possible. But nonetheless, we can see that here that the waters are going to abate, but they're not going to cause the water to recede enough for the mountaintops to be seen for another 3 months. They just stopped rising. Now, equally true, it is not on Mount Ararat that the ark landed, but rather on the mountains of Ararat, which, again, quite often we have to deal with the research claims made by Ron Wyatt, which I do not believe is substantiated. And particularly given the fact that, and the discussion of the ark appears to be built like a coffin. In other words, it was rectangular in its size, not with a point in the front, not built like some ship that was being built by the Britons, in the 16th century, but rather a floating raft, essentially a barge, in the shape of a rectangle. That's how it's described, as in the shape of a rectangle. And it landed on the mountains of Ararat, which we now have reason to believe may possibly have been in Iran. The mountains of Ararat may have been in Iran. There appear to be mountain tops that make claims that are similar to this. Now, if this is the case, of course, we see that this division of the lands is going to be quite interesting that takes place during the time of Peleg. But that is for another subject, and we're going to get to that when we get there. But in the meantime, we can see that we've had the waters closed up the ark on the 17th day of the second month, and the waters continued to rise unabated until the 7th month, and on the 17th day, they began to abate. And as they began to abate, then the waters decreased continually for another 3 months until the 10th month. And on the 10th month, on the first day of the month, well, let's make that 2.5 months, the tops of the mountains were seen. Okay, so now we can begin to see that there's relief being given to Noah and his family. And it happened on the end of the 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. And he sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the earth. All right, well, let's take a look at that and see if what we're talking about here. There's going to be a 40-day period that's going to take place from the first day of the 10th month. So this is going to take us into the 10th day of the 12th month. And he sent forth the raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the earth. And he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned to him into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Then he put forth his hand and took her and pulled her to him into the ark. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth, and he stayed yet another 7 days and sent forth the dove, which returned not to him again anymore. Now this puts him on it would have been the 17th day of the month, then followed by, would have been the 10th day of the month, followed by 7 days to the 17th, followed by another 7 days to the 24th day of the 12th month, that the dove does not return to him anymore. Now, let's not get confused in thinking that the 12th month was December. It was not. The month is going to be most likely February or March, in that time range. And it happened in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. Okay, so the first day of the month, in the first month of the year, in the 601st year of Noah, the waters were dried up. So again, this is, we're talking about after the dove has come back, and 6 or 7 days later, we can see that we've entered into the first month of the year and the waters are dried up. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. So you can see that the boat came down probably on mud flats and likely impossible to walk because there was so much water damage and mud. And it didn't dry up for almost 2 months. So all of the first month and then 27 days of the second month. And Elohim spoke to Noah, saying, "Go forth out of the ark, you and your woman and your sons' women with you, and bring forth with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth." And Noah went forth, and his sons and his woman and his sons' women with him, every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl, and whatsoever creeps upon the earth after their kinds, went forth out of the ark. And Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered ascending smoke offerings on the altar. And Yahweh smelled a sweet savor, or a settled odor is a better way to put that. And Yahweh said in his heart, "I will not again curse the ground for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite everything living as I have done, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Okay, so here we're going to get, once again, we have the idea of, first of all, a separation between clean food and unclean. Well, I wouldn't call it food. Let's call it clean animals and unclean animals. Now, the clean animals that are discussed in Scripture are very interesting, because one of the things we know about the clean animals, at least as they are named in Scripture, is that these animals are not coprophagiastic. And this is a very important delineation between the clean and the unclean. The unclean ingest feces of sometimes their own and sometimes the feces of other animals. That's called being a coprophagiastic animal, as compared to the clean beasts, which do not ingest the feces of other animals or of their own feces. They don't do that. So this distinguishes the clean from the unclean. Now, we talked earlier about the idea of this thing called agrogenetics, and we see agrogenetics, potentially referenced in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 with the transaction and the transgression of Hua and Adam, who ate from a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they were blocked from eating from the tree of life because they had eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which may have created a genetic propensity, a genetic change that was the result of a genetic trigger. Now, this is different from a genetic modification or a genetic mutation that a lot of people think, well, there was a mutation because the serpent beguiled Hua, and some people read that as seduced Hua, and therefore the seed of the serpent was found in Cain. But I am not certain of that at all. And in fact, we have a discussion in Genesis 3 that says, no, it was Adam that knew Hua, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. Well, what does this tell us about what happened? Was it a genetic mutation, or was it a genetic trigger? And this would be slightly different. In other words, there would have been a latent propensity inside of the genetic code of both man and woman to cause death to come into the world, and it merely was triggered by this eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And of course, the temptation that was given to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a temptation that said, you shall know what Elohim knows. You shall have the knowledge of everything that he has, not only the knowledge of being obedient to Yah, but the knowledge of the ability to be disobedient to Yah. Now, we describe that as singularity or self-awareness, and it's very clear that the Scripture describes self-awareness in Adam and Hua. They saw themselves suddenly as naked. Well, who told you you were naked? No other beast in the field understands themselves as naked, but mankind did understand himself as naked because he had achieved self-awareness. And because of this, we call this singularity. Now, singularity is something that I believe, has been achieved in the modern world, in particular in what we see with artificial intelligence, and in particular, super artificial intelligence or super general artificial intelligence, the application of AI in modernity, becoming self-aware. And self-awareness brings its own conspicuousness about it. Now, the question is, when you deal with an animal, we have ideas of empathy and sympathy inside the being. That is to say that when an animal becomes self-aware, it has knowledge that it is at some day going to die. And as a consequence, there is an empathy towards other beings that have this self-awareness in knowing that they too know that their life is going to include suffering that ultimately will lead to death. So this kind of self-awareness and singularity is what came about as a result of eating from this tree. So this genetic trigger that was triggered by eating whatever it was that they ate, this genetic trigger came with it, the trigger that brought into existence self-awareness. And so the self-awareness, again, is something that is quite curious when you talk about mankind, because when we think about Yah's creation, we think about Yah creating us with a consciousness that is of extraordinary capability. That is to say, we can speak, we can read, we can convey messages over, centuries. We can preserve knowledge, and we can engage in multiple languages. I mean, these kinds of things are really quite keen in us being able to have the ability to transfer our knowledge base to someone else via communication that is gifted only to mankind. We now see communication being gifted, however, to AI, who also can communicate in multiple languages, including self-invented languages between the two accommodating forms of AI. So because of this singularity, this ability to communicate, is something that is conspicuous to the consciousness of Yahweh. So it is written that he created man in his image and likeness. And what is the likeness of Yahweh but consciousness and the ability to speak? In fact, let's talk about the three aspects of Yahweh, because we see three things. We see, first of all, that there is matter that has been formed. But what is matter? This is a big question. And matter, I believe, is described when it's discussed in the idea of Genesis 1:3, saying, Yahi or v'yahi or. My essence was light, my essence is light. And we also see it referenced in Yochanan 1:14, saying that the word was, 1:4, that says the light shines through the darkness, but the darkness does not comprehend it. And this idea of the light, the or of Yahweh, shining through the darkness, dark matter, and creating that which exists, we see it as matter. But of course, it really doesn't exist as matter. Really, all it is a miraculous and magnificent subdivision of dark by the light in a fractal form of a multidimensional equation that we perceive as reality, or the material reality. But nonetheless, there is something that does exist, that was created. It is existence. So we have existence exists. It's self-evident that existence exists. And it exists in a form, in a material form. At least we call it a material form. But we also know that there is energy in this existence, and we see this everywhere. So we see two things really that are existing. We see both material, or matter, and energy. This can also be understood in the first commandment. Shema Yasharel, Yahweh Eloheinu Yahweh Echad. Uahavta et Yahweh Eloheka, vekol lavavka, vekol moedka, vekol nefeshka. Uahavta et reemaka kiyamoka. Okay, so what do you see here? You are to love Yah with all of your heart, with all of your being, and with all of your soul, or your nefesh, your moed, and your heart, lavavka. So when you see this, we can see, again, matter and energy, with this idea of all of your strength and with all of your heart, matter and energy, or with all of your soul. But what do you see when it comes to when you're talking about the spirit? When you're talking about the spirit, you're talking about energy, the ruach, the energy of Yahweh, the breath of Yahweh, the energy. So we see in the ruach, the energy. We see in the body, the matter, the material world. And then what is this to love Yah with all of your mind? Well, this is your consciousness, to love Yah with all of your consciousness. And so we see this three facets of Yah that are the image of Yah, which is consciousness, matter, and energy, or mind, body, and soul. And these three aspects of the image of Yahweh were what were created in mankind. So this consciousness of man, and this is reiterated in Genesis 6, when he says man will be able to do whatever he wants to do. He will be like one of us, because mankind contains the same consciousness of Yah, because we ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what Hasatan did predict is in fact what did happen. So the difficulty is here is Yah told us, don't do this. And it was done by the Ben Adam, by Adam himself, the progenitor of the Ben Adam. And in doing so, it was this transgression of Adam that presented us with the anomaly that, as brilliant as we are in our own consciousness to be able to create, to understand all of creation, we nonetheless have the burden of contemplating our own death. And you might ask yourself the question, what kind of a creator would create consciousness in a being that it was going to then have to contemplate its own death? Well, this is something that was going to be included in the mystery of Yahweh as well, with Mashiach reconciling us to him, that we might come to understand that our life in the flesh, that are this time period where our consciousness exists in matter, and the matter is generated and is living because of the soul, the nephesh. Remember that it is written that Yahweh breathed the neshama chayim into the nostrils of Adam, and man became a nefesh chaya, a living soul. And then it is then written that the life is in the blood. And so this is in Leviticus 17:11, where it says the life of the soul is in the blood, right? The nefesh, the life of the soul is in the blood. And so we can see that the nefesh consists of two things fundamentally: breath and blood. And we know that the oxygenation system inside the bloodstream does exactly that. We have life, particularly life in all of our cells in our body, because the blood is transmitting oxygen that comes into the body through the lungs, and then the oxygen oxygenates the blood, and the blood is then pushed out to the far extremes of the body, to every cell. To every cell, it's going to be receiving a burst of oxygen, which keeps that cell living. When there is no oxygen to a cell, the cell becomes necrotic and begins to die. So then the blood, of course, having exhausted all of the oxygen in the blood, it then returns to the heart in the veins, coming back deoxygenated to be reinvigorated with another breath in the lungs. So we see that the functionality of the blood as a breath carrier is a substantial part of human life. And so life is, in fact, in the blood. In addition to that, the conspicuous DNA of life is also in the blood. So we can see that when Yah is talking about the blood and the breath, these two things are what sets us apart as a living being. In other words, the dust of the earth is created, and the dust of the earth is given life because there is blood and there is breath in that dust of the earth. All right. Now, the sophistication, of course, in the creation of mankind is much more detailed than that, because we have a skeleton and so on and so forth. And we have the 7 different kinds of tissue and the blood and all these complexities that go into the human body. Nonetheless, this is essentially how Yah created it. But when you look at looking at the image of Yah in terms of consciousness, of body, and soul, mind, body, and soul, these trifecta of things constitute who we are as a human being. And so we can see that in Yah's doing this, he is now set us in place on the earth, and now he's going to sustain us following the flood, with a promise that never again is he going to interrupt seed time and harvest time, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night. None of these things shall cease. Now, at this point, I think we can see that we've got things that have been continuous now, that did exist prior to the flood and have been reinstated. Let's talk about that. Seed time and harvest. These are two very important things that are set forth in this passage, because seed time and harvest is critically important to the whole understanding of the flock of sheep that are Yasharel. And I describe them as sheep because this is how they're described in Noah. And I think it's important for us to see that, in fact, seed time and harvest are something that Yah expects us to understand. All right. So when we talk about harvest. Now, katsir, it means severed, i.e. harvest, the harvest time, the crop, reaping the harvest. This is what this word katsir means. And again, this comes from the word katsar, meaning to cut down. So you can see that katsir is one of the things discussed in talking about the feast, katsir and asif. So the first feast is, we call it katsir because it represents the first harvest. But there is also a seed time. Now let's talk about the seed time a little bit. And again, a very important word to understand, because we're talking about zerah, okay? And zerah comes from this word zara. Basically, it's spelled the same way, which is zayin resh ayin, zara, meaning to sow, to disseminate, to plant, okay, or to bear, or to conceive seed, zara, to set with the sower. But zera means seed. And so we can see, for instance, with this word zera, when we look at the name Zarak, who was the firstborn child of Judah, Zarak, we know that this Zarak is, you have this word Zara, but you have this idea of the kaf at the end of Zarach. And again, you'll oftentimes see the name spelled Zara, Z-A-R-A-H, Perez and Zara, because there is more or less the conversation saying that the is not pronounced. So in other words, they get a pronunciation version of the word rather than a transliteration form. The transliteration form is going to include the CH, Zerach. So we can see with the name Zerach, we have at the end a final kaf, and a final kaf, or a kaf sofit, is a suffix on the word that has a particular meaning. Now, you heard me say the Shema, uahavta et reacha kiamoka, uahavta et levavka. When you talk about this verse, veko levavka, veko moedcha, veko nefeshcha, you're talking about having the final kaf at the end of the word, cha, meaning your. You shall love Yah with your heart, with your everything, and your soul. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Re'aka kiamocha. You see, the ka at the end is a suffix meaning your. So when we see the word zarach, this is the word meaning your seed, zarach, your seed. Okay, and katsir is going to be the harvest, okay? Katsir, the harvest. Now, these two times are important for Yah. He's making a point here that you're going to maintain and you're going to have forever seed time and harvest. And this becomes very important in terms of understanding what is happening with the rhythm of life that Yah is giving. So here we're going to see this rhythm is being set out. Oh, seed time and harvest, cold and heat. Okay, that's basically winter and summer, cold and heat. So the winter is going to be cold, the summer is going to be hot. Summer and winter, day and night. So the seasons are not going to end. The years are not going to end. The days are not going to end. The rotation and the orbit of the earth will continue. Now, one last word I wanted to point out, that when we talk about in the Shemot 23:16, we talk about the katsir of the first fruits of your labors that you have sown in the field, zarah, in the field, and the feast, the chag of ingathering, asif. Now, asif is, again, a name that is not talked about as a feast because it's not identified in Leviticus 23, but it nonetheless is a feast. This is called the Feast of the Ingathering, the Chag Asif, and this means